Number 10. The don't lick anything in the lab rule. It all began with a researcher who, driven by a level of curiosity only questionable judgment can explain, believed that tasting an unknown sample would be an efficient identification technique. He brought the test tube to his mouth with the same confidence as someone tasting warm chocolate fudge straight from the pan. The liquid looked harmless, but the warning list was longer than a government service line. Minutes later, he felt numbness in his tongue, his ego, and probably his entire resume. When questioned, he said he just wanted to speed up the process. The climax came when they discovered the substance was meant for testing material resistance, not human resistance. Thus was born the global rule: never lick anything that requires gloves, a mask, a diploma, and basic common sense to handle. And if you're still unsure, remember, if not even an ant would taste it, you definitely shouldn't. Number 9. Never mix substances just because they're the same color. The incident began when a student decided that two blue liquids must naturally get along, as if they were long-lost cartoon siblings. He mixed them with the excitement of someone making homemade slime, completely ignoring the fine print on the labels. The reaction was immediate. The solution bubbled, foamed, and came alive, climbing up the container like a newly awakened chemical monster. The room filled with a smell that resembled burnt plastic and regret. The climax occurred when the ceiling gained a bluish explosion stain that never came off, turning the lab into a toxic cloud observatory. The rule formed instantly: color has nothing to do with chemical compatibility. If it did, every blue ocean would be drinkable. But it isn't, and nobody should have to learn this the hard way. Number 8. Safety goggles. The wall between you and your bad decisions. A researcher decided to observe a reaction up close, a phrase that, in a laboratory, is basically an invitation for destiny to give you an educational slap. He leaned over the beaker as if checking cold coffee. The mixture bubbled, quietly popped, and launched corrosive micro-droplets onto his face. By some scientific miracle, he was wearing regular glasses, which absorbed the impact like unsung heroes. For days, he wore the splash marks like someone returning from a domestic chemical war. The climax came when he confessed he hadn't stood up because he didn't want to interrupt his thought flow. Since then, the rule stands firm: safety goggles are not decoration. They are the only barrier between your eyes and your own recklessness. Vision, unlike ego, does not grow back. Number 7. The pen that became a projectile rule. It began when a chemist, too lazy to grab a proper tool, used his favorite pen to poke an unstable flask. The object vibrated, slipped, and exploded with the force of a mischievous sneeze, turning the pen into a confused missile. It flew across the room and left a hole in the ceiling that looked like the autograph of an impatient ghost. The climax wasn't the explosion, but the discovery that the pen belonged to the boss, a permanent reminder that spontaneous creativity rarely mixes well with glassware, gases, and applied chemistry. The rule emerged quickly: writing instruments are for writing, not for testing physics. In a lab, any unlikely object that becomes an extension of your hand can also become the reason for your incident report and your concentrated shame. Number 6. Flammable storage. The perfect marriage for everything to go wrong. A rushed researcher placed flammable bottles beside a heater because it would only be for 5 minutes. 5 minutes in a lab equals a parallel universe of potential disasters. A tiny spark escaped the heater, found the solvent, and created a pyrotechnic display worthy of New Year's Eve, minus the fun part. Flames rose quickly, lighting up the lab in a color no one wanted to see again. The climax arrived when asked why the bottles were there. He simply stared at the floor, the most incriminating silent answer in history. The rule solidified: things that catch fire should not be beside things that enjoy catching fire. Toxic chemical relationships do exist, and they usually last less than the laboratory. Number 5. Testing inventions on yourself. Ego versus electricity. An inventor built an experimental electric stimulator and, fueled by scientific overconfidence, decided to test it on his own arm. The device buzzed, vibrated, and delivered a shock so powerful he flew across the room in a spasm worthy of a low-budget horror film. For a few seconds, everyone thought he had invented a new form of involuntary dance. The climax came when he recovered and said he wanted to try again, but with fine adjustments. That was enough to turn the entire team into passionate defenders of the new rule: inventors are not test subjects. Human trials require ethics, authorization, and preferably volunteers who did not just finish building the device. After all, the line between genius and electrocution is thin and usually sizzling. Number 4. The poorly closed lid that became a grenade. A pressurized gas flask was left improperly sealed during a routine experiment. The internal pressure, completely ignoring human wishes, pushed the lid until it launched like a liberated projectile. The flask spun, ricocheted, and sprayed liquid everywhere, creating a scene that looked like a chemical crime. The lid flew across the room and left a perfectly circular mark on the wall, as if designed intentionally. The climax came when the responsible party admitted, "I thought it was closed enough." That sentence alone became the definition of a pre-announced disaster. The rule became clear: lids exist to be properly closed, not to test your luck. In a lab, a poorly clicked seal is the difference between a calm routine and pressurized chaos. 3. Heating the unknown. The recipe for green smoke. A student found an unlabeled flask and concluded that the best approach was to heat it, like microwaving leftovers, without knowing what they are. He placed the flask on the hot plate and waited. The mixture began trembling like a panicked vibrating phone. Moments later, it released a green smoke straight out of a witch's cauldron. The climax came with the complete evacuation of the laboratory, while the student insisted he was just speeding up the process. The final report described the reaction as potentially dangerous and the student as dangerously confident. The rule was born strong: never heat what you cannot name. In a lab, surprise rarely means good news, and almost always means masks and forced ventilation. Number 2. The tragedy of the scientist knows. A researcher believed he could identify vapors by smell alone. He placed his face near the tube, inhaled deeply, and within seconds entered a symphony of coughing, tears, and regret. His voice became so high-pitched that for days he sounded like an animated character in existential crisis. The climax came when he justified his method by saying the vapor seemed light. After the scare, they discovered the compound released an irritating gas used for respiratory resistance testing. The rule became immortal: noses are not chemical analyzers. They don't come with filters, protection, or an instruction manual. The only thing they detect with precision is the exact moment you realize you messed up. Number 1. The red button that should never have been pressed. The reign of laboratory foolishness ends here. A scientist found an unlabeled red button, large, shiny, practically inviting. Like any human driven by reckless curiosity, he pressed it. Instantly, the entire lab plunged into darkness, followed by flickering lights, blaring alarms, and a mechanical arm beginning a possessed choreography. The chaos lasted only seconds, but the panic was enough to rewrite internal safety protocols. The climax came when they discovered the button disabled the safety system stabilizing sensitive reactions. In other words, he accidentally opened the door to a small-scale chemical apocalypse. The rule became absolute: never press a red button unless you know exactly what it does. Curiosity is great until it becomes a detonator.